At the start of 1612, there was nothing especially remarkable about this area of Pendle in Lancashire. It was a beautiful rural landscape marked by small villages. People's lives hadn't changed much for hundreds of years, and they had no reason to suspect this wouldn't continue. Yet in 1612, something suddenly went terribly wrong. By the end of the summer, a number of people in this community, most of them women, were left swinging from the gallows as a large crowd gathered to watch their final, excruciating moments. Their alleged crime was witchcraft.
So what on earth happened here? How had things gone so wrong in society that this could happen under the rule of law? That these people struggling to eke out a living became the subject of such fierce and condemnatory scrutiny and convicted without any solid evidence?
In this film, I'm going to get to the heart of it all. This is the story of the Pendle Witch Trials. The story of the Pendle Witches is not actually a story about witches or spirits as we might think of them today. It's a story, a tragedy really, of ordinary people, mainly impoverished women, living ordinary lives. And it all started right here on the 21st of March, 1612. On this very road between Trawden Forest and the market town of Colne, a local woman named Alison Devise was begging, as she so often did. A man, a peddler, John Law, passed her by. But something happened between them on this road, an incident, and it was this incident which set off a string of terrible events.
To find out what happened, I'm meeting local historian and tour guide Simon Entwistle.
So Simon, you brought me here in the shadow of Pendle Hill. Why are we here then?
Well, this pathway would have looked exactly the same as it would have done in 1612, the Colne to Trawden Road, beneath the shadow of Pendle Hill.
So Alison Devise and John Law met on this road. Can you tell me exactly what happened there?
She had a confrontation with John Law, the Halifax peddler. She begged some pins off him. He refused to take his pack off because he knew she had no money. She begged again, just a few pins, sir. All of a sudden, this huge black dog came from nowhere. The dog sat next to Alison, and the dog talked. "What wouldst thou want me to do to him? I can lame him." "Lame him," she screamed. Law felt this terrible pain on his left side and collapsed in agony on the pathway between Colne and Trawden.
Okay, so it appears that John Law had been cursed, but what really happened, do you think?
It's very likely he had a stroke, but in those days it would be classed as witchcraft.
So what happened to John Law after this?
He was taken to an old alehouse. He was in a terrible state for a good 3 days. When his voice returned, he screamed out that he'd been cursed by this young girl in the forest of Pendle with a dog, and asked letters to be sent home to his family in Halifax, which they were. His eldest son, Abraham, made his way to Colne and saw his father in this twisted and contorted state. "Father, what's happened to you?" "I've been cursed, lad. Go into the woods, find this young girl called Alison Devise. She's cursed me. Find her, bring her here, reverse the curse." Abraham went into the forest of Pendle, found her, brought her back to the old alehouse, where she made eye contact with John Law. Law looked up from his sick bed. "It's you! You're the witch! You've cursed me!" She burst into tears and begged forgiveness. She had no idea she had just admitted to a state capital offence of witchcraft. And strange enough, John Law, the Halifax peddler, was about to forgive her, but not his son Abraham. He went to see the local magistrate, Roger Noel, and in doing so, he opened what we now call the Pendle Witch Trials of 1612.
Alison Devise, along with her mother and brother, was summoned to appear before Roger Noel, where she once again confessed her crimes, apparently convinced of her own powers. When questioned about another local family who had also been tainted by accusations of witchcraft, Alison saw an opportunity to settle scores in a bitter neighbourly feud.
At the heart of this story are two families. They lived a short distance from each other and their paths must have crossed on a regular basis. They were remarkably similar, both only just putting bread on the table, making a living out of begging or doing odd jobs for better off neighbours. Both were headed by a matriarch, which was an unsettling concept for people in the 17th century. At the head of one family was Elizabeth Southerns, known as Old Demdike. By 1612, she was frail and blind. At the head of the second family was Anne Whittle, known as Old Chattox. Old Chattox, like Old Demdike, was a widow. She was probably in her 80s by 1612. Now, these two families had a long-held rivalry. Old Demdike and Old Chattox must have known each other all their lives, probably being girls together, married, raised families, and were now in old age. But it was a mutual distrust bordering on hatred, a rivalry which was always there to add fuel to the fire.
With several members of both families now awaiting trial for witchcraft on the orders of Roger Nowell, the authorities were on high alert. So, when a large gathering of people was organised at the home of the Demdikes on Good Friday 1612, an investigation began.
Many historians believe that this very area we are now in was indeed the home of the Devise family at Malkin Tower.
Convinced that the meeting had been called for sinister purposes, everyone who attended, no matter what their connection was to the family, was implicated. Nowell ordered the arrest of a further 8 people on charges of witchcraft.
The accused were made to walk 40 miles from Pendle to Lancaster to be imprisoned here at Lancaster Castle, where they spent several months awaiting trial. The original courtroom no longer exists, although there was a new courtroom built on the same site later on, which is still in use to this day. The cell where they were held, however, has survived the ravages of time. To show me around is the museum manager of Lancaster Castle, Dr. Colin Penny. Wow, so Colin, this is it. This is the cell where you think that the Pendle witches were held.
Yep, tradition has it that they were kept down here.
Can you tell me a bit about what the conditions would have been like down here?
Dreadful. I mean, it's July now. It's cold down here, and they were imprisoned from April, when it would have been very wet, probably raining a lot. Water would have been running down the walls. There's no sanitation down here, and you were eating your food in absolute filth.
And I've noticed these rings on the floor. Are they something to do with the accused that were kept here?
It's been suggested that people might have been chained to them if they were being particularly disruptive.
Now, of course, they would have been down here, those two rival families together. Do you think that was a tense time?
Very. Yeah, I mean, they didn't get on when they weren't in the same room. I mean, you can imagine that when they were thrown together down here, each having accused the other one, they were going to have a fair few ding-dong arguments, but they probably didn't last that long because the conditions would have taken their toll. They would have probably become quite poorly, and we know Old Demdike died.
Can you just tell me a bit more about what happened there?
Well, she was in her 80s, the conditions, they were awful, and prison populations were decimated by illnesses such as typhoid, cholera, and something known as jail fever, which was typhus. That was caused by the bites from body lice. So it's quite possible that she caught one of those illnesses, and yeah, she passed away down here.
So people would have been down here in the darkness for months on end in these horrific conditions and then taken up outside into the bright light and taken to court. And could you just tell me a bit about what that experience would have been like?
First thing is they wouldn't have been able to see, probably for some time. It may very well have given them headaches and things like that. And then they're supposed to go into court and plead their case. You know, they wouldn't have been in any condition. If you think about James Devise, he was a young man. And when he entered the castle, he was fit. By the time he got into the court, he could barely walk and talk.
One of the women accused of witchcraft has gained more attention than most, perhaps because she was comparatively well off. I've travelled to the village she lived in to learn more about her story.
So, Alice, we're in the village of Roughly. This is the statue of probably the most famous of all the Pendle Witches, Alice Nutter.
Oh, Alice Nutter. But of course, she's not part of the Chattox family or the Demdike family, so how does she get involved in this?
She was a very wealthy lady, and she was totally different to the rest of the so-called witches in the fact that she would not need to beg. There's a lot of speculation that she may have known Roger Nowell and had a land dispute with him, and won that land dispute. Nowell thought, I need to get rid of this woman. How? The little girl, Jeanette Devise, who testified in the courts at Lancaster that she'd been at Malkin Tower on Good Friday 1612.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? That Roger Nowell had a vested interest in Alice's fall.
Very much so. Her story is shrouded in mystery, but certainly in Potts's book he mentions that she made a plea of not guilty, and many people, myself included, believe she was totally innocent of the crimes against her.
It's strange, isn't it, how Alice Nutter is the only one who's really remembered. You know, she's got a statue here and people seem to know her name. They want to be connected to her. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's anything to do with the fact that, you know, she was completely separate, she was the wealthy one and everyone else was kind of impoverished?
It's the evidence against her which I find really hard to take in. She's found guilty of aiding Demdike and Alison Devise in the murder of Henry Mitten, a man who lived in this village, for a penny. She wouldn't need to beg.
It's really weak evidence,
and
isn't
it's
it?
Weak evidence. But on the evidence of that little girl, Jeanette, she was found guilty of his murder and aiding those two other so-called witches.
So why were there quite so many accused of witchcraft in Lancashire at this time? Well, although no one could have predicted the events of 1612, there are several long-term factors which created a perfect setting for such accusations to flourish.
Let's wind back the clock to the mid-15th century. The development of the printing press in Europe allowed many new ideas to spread fast. One publication which was immensely popular was the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of the Witches. The Malleus was effectively a manual for hunting and persecuting witches. It was first published in 1486, predating James I's demonology by quite some time, and the Malleus went much further than James I's later text. It was created by two Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, and it has been described by the historian Christine Goudier as a deeply misogynistic text. She explains that Kramer, in particular, believed that women were the weaker sex, not just physically, but morally too. He considered them tools of the devil, lustfully attempting to ensnare men, leading them away from their righteous path. So potent were some of these ideas that some believe that it was this book which was largely responsible for the large numbers of deaths during the European witch craze in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries.
On the afternoon of Sunday, the 16th of August, two judges arrived, tired and dusty, at Lancaster Castle to preside over the assize court. They were Sir James Altham and Sir Edward Bromley. The trial began. One by one, the accused emerged from the darkness of their prison, filthy, dishevelled and confused. They were brought before a judge and a jury of 12 men chosen from the middle ranks of local society and scrutinised.
First came Anne Whittle, that's old Chattox, an elderly lady who was weak and frail. Anne was accused of the murder of a man, Robert Nutter, to which she pleaded not guilty. The event in question had happened 2 decades previously, and the evidence given was that her family were commonly reputed to be witches, and that milk turned sour at their touch. It was flimsy evidence at best. But faced with an onslaught of evidence against her, old Chattox broke down. With weeping tears, she humbly acknowledged the evidence to be true, and cried out unto God for mercy and forgiveness of her sins, and humbly prayed my Lord to be merciful unto Anne Redfern, her daughter.
Next came Elizabeth Devise, the daughter of old Demdike, who was charged of 3 counts of murder. Elizabeth was known as Squinting Lizzie because she had one eye set above the other. It was a detail that the clerk of the court, Thomas Potts, was keen to draw attention to, describing it as a preposterous mark of nature. But Elizabeth was about to face a vicious accusation, a witness of her own flesh and blood. It was her 9-year-old daughter, Janet. The moment Elizabeth saw Janet enter the court, she began to scream in such a fearful manner, it was recorded, as all the court did not a little wonder at her, and so amazed the child as with weeping tears she cried out unto my lord the judge, and told him she was not able to speak in the presence of her mother. And so Elizabeth was removed from the dock, and her daughter Janet was placed on a table in full view of the court. And there she told the court how her mother was a witch with a familiar spirit, a brown dog named Bull, and with these powers she had on 3 occasions been guilty of murder. The trial took just 2 days. Judge Bromley read out the verdict on Wednesday the 19th of August. He said, "It only remains I pronounce the judgment of the courts against you by the King's authority, which is, you shall go hence to the castle from whence you came, from thence you shall be carried to the place of execution for this county, where your bodies shall be hanged until you be dead, and God have mercy upon your souls."
The Pendle Witch Trials resulted in 10 people being sentenced to death. On the basis of evidence that would not be admitted in regular courts, even in the 17th century, 8 women and 2 men would face a public hanging.
Only one woman, Margaret Pearson, was allowed to live. Her punishment, she was placed in the pillories on the market day at 4 different towns. Her crime was written on a piece of paper and fastened to her head. One of these towns was Clitheroe, where we are now, and around this spot is where she would have been. She was constrained while she was then taunted and pelted with objects, and after this she was returned to the tower at Lancaster Castle and forced to endure a year longer imprisoned in those terrible conditions.
The condemned were taken up to a site known as Gallows Hill on the outskirts of Lancaster. As they headed up the slope, they may have glanced back to see one of the most magnificent views in England, that of Morecambe Bay. Having lived their entire lives inland, it's possible that this was the first time those men and women had seen the sea.
For those condemned, a priest was arranged to tend to them and advise them to repent and pray for forgiveness. Then, on Thursday the 20th of August, they were piled into a cart and taken here, what is now Williamson Park, a hill just outside the city. We aren't sure exactly where the gallows were, but it would have certainly been in a prominent place, possibly where this Ashton Memorial now stands. A large crowd gathered as the cart was brought to a stop. It was death by strangulation, and their final moments would have been excruciating. Pendle was once a largely inaccessible part of the country, yet today people flock here. They come to see what happened to those famous witches. There are witch-themed shops and witches' brews to be bought. But the problem with this is that it puts these events in the realm of magic, of make-believe, of fantasy, whereas actually this is a story, a tragedy, of ordinary people, generally women, often at the lowest levels of society. Women who, like many others, clung on to the superstitions and folklore of the day and were known to dabble in divination and spellcasting, maybe as a desperate attempt to stay above water in a tough world that they lived. There were women like this up and down the country, of course, but the difference was here in Pendle was that they were subject to ferocious scrutiny, scapegoated for random ills in society by the heavy hand of the law, all of which was driven by a complex web of external forces and personal motivations.
It wasn't until 1684, over 6 decades after the Pendle Trials, that the last execution for witchcraft took place in England. By then, over 500 people had been killed by the state. James I's statute on witchcraft was eventually repealed in 1736 by George II, finally bringing an end to that dark period in the nation's history.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.